Good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Mental Health and Students with Complex Communication Needs, Let's Talk About It, presented by Kathy Howery. My name is Betsy Caporal, and I am your facilitator for this evening's webinar. Tonight's program is brought to you by the U.S. Society for AAC, or USAC, the voice of AAC. Thanks to the USAC Organizing Committee and to Isaac for making this possible. Speaking of Isaac, we are grateful for the use of the Isaac webinar system. With this system, if you are using the telephone option rather than the computer audio option, please note that the number may incur a long-distance charge. USAC is thrilled with the response to tonight's topic. We have over 100 people registered. This webinar is free. We hope you will join USAC by going to www.ussaac.org/membership. Our new membership year began January 1st, 2019. Remember that one of the member benefits is a substantial reduction in registration for the biannual Isaac Conference, which will be held next year in Mexico. Go to www.isaac.online.org to learn more about this fabulous opportunity. A quick disclosure, I have no relevant financial or non-financial relationships to disclose relevant to the content of this webinar. Some quick logistics, your microphone will be muted. You can ask questions by typing into the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Questions will be answered as time allows in the last segment of the webinar. We may group together questions that are similar, and we ask that you pose your question in a general fashion rather than related to a specific individual. Questions that are not responded to during the webinar may be answered afterwards via email. A word about continuing education. The ASHA CEU participant form and certificate of attendance can be found at the website shown, www.isaac.online.org/English/news/webinars. You must stay for the duration of the webinar in order to receive credit, and our webinar platform does let us see who is on and for how long. Directions for submitting the completed form are also on the site. Please note that registrants will receive a follow-up email that provides the link to the archive, the CEU forms, and instructions. Tonight, CEs will only be available for USAC members, and they are free. The learning objectives for this evening: participants will learn about how mental health can be negatively affected by communication challenges, about how the impact of having to make one's voice heard through a SGD may create situations of vulnerability and abuse for students in institutional context, how the Communication Bill of Rights can be used to proactively address potential maltreatment and support mental wellness in children and youth who use AAC. Before I introduce our speaker, if you have just joined us, I want to remind you that if you're using the telephone option rather than computer audio, you may incur long-distance charges. About our speaker, Kathy Howery, PhD, is an educational consultant and a sessional lecturer at several universities in Alberta. Her doctoral research sought to understand what it is like for young people with complex communication needs to speak with speech-generating devices. Kathy began her career over 30 years ago, finding ways for students with complex needs to share their voices. Most recently, Kathy is working under contract with Alberta Education as part of the Alberta Provincial Wide Low Incidence Collaborative Supports Team, with primary responsibility in the area of complex communication needs. And now I'm excited to present our presenter, Dr. Kathy Howery.
Oh, there we go. Hello, Betsy. Thank you. And thank you for unmuting me. I just want to make sure before we go forward, okay, there we go, that I'm going to show my screen. Give us a couple seconds here. We're getting some of the technical things there. Can Betsy, if you could, or Franklin, just let me know that people can actually see my screen now. Is that true? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Just all these technical issues, we want to make sure that they work. So thank you for being here. Welcome for being here. I know that we all have busy lives, and I appreciate you taking the time out to join with me in what I hope will be a continuing conversation around this topic. I guess to say I'm excited about presenting it is partially true. Do I wish it was something that I didn't have to present? Yes, that's true too. So anyway, hello and welcome. I just a little blurb. I am Canadian, and it's Canadian Mental Health Week, and so I thought I would do a shout out for that. And Franklin says hooray for Canada. Yes, as you all know, Franklin is also Canadian, and some of the people that I'm going to talk about tonight are also Canadian. I particularly love the hashtag about our Canadian Mental Health Week this year, hashtag Get Loud. And I think really the underwriting maybe a theme for tonight, or maybe a takeaway for tonight, is for us to all take that hashtag forward as we're talking about our students with complex communication needs. Okay, so things that I'm going to talk about, and then I hope that we all have some time to talk about at the end, and that I hope more than anything that we'll continue to talk about after this evening session is mental health and why it matters, and particularly why it matters for people with complex communication needs. I'm going to share some stories, I guess some illustrative stories that I've gathered from young people with who have complex communication needs, and how their stories illustrate challenges with mental health. As was alluded to, I'm going to talk about how maybe we can use the Communication Bill of Rights and some other supports along the way to proactively advocate for and support our students' mental health. And then finally, I'm going to land on some ideas that I have to support mental health of students who require AAC. And I'm hoping at that juncture, we'll be able to have a conversation about it in greater depth between all of us. Oops, I'm sorry. So before I start, however, I need to give a big shout out to a few people. Most importantly, Monica Bratt, who's the Inclusive Education Lead in Medicine Hat Catholic Schools. Medicine Hat is a city in Alberta. Monica was instrumental in taking up the challenge when of creating this talk in the first place for a session here in Alberta. Monica was very helpful to me in learning about issues around mental health. I'm not a mental health expert, but Monica had done some work in that. So Monica, thank you so much for your important contribution to what's this talk tonight. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Dick Sobsey, who's a professor emeritus from the University of Alberta. Some of you who have done work or reading in the area of maltreatment and abuse for people with disabilities will know that Dick is a preeminent expert in the area, and he's been gracious enough to have many conversations with me as I've tried to grapple with the stories that I have heard. Erin Sheldon, again, probably many of you have heard of her. She's a Canadian we're adopting her as a Canadian AT specialist, AAC specialist, special ed lead. Erin and I, again, have had many conversations about how we can make kids with complex communication needs safe and reduce their risk for mental health. I'm going to be quoting Erin this evening particularly. I'd shout out to Dr. Harold Johnson, who's professor of education in Michigan State University. Harold has led the charge, I guess I would say, for the Council for Exceptional Children's Policy on Prevention and Response to Maltreatment. And it was Harold who, when I said, yeah, but what about kids who can't raise their own voices, said you need to be talking about this. So I am very grateful to him. And finally, perhaps most importantly, I need to give a big shout out to the participants in my study who have entrusted me with the stories of their lives and their lived experience. This is a talk to people who I'm sure everyone knows who we're talking about, kids with complex communication needs. But I threw this slide in as a little reminder in case there's somebody that came and said, what is this complex communication needs of what you speak? This is a definition that we've rather adopted in Alberta, and it's one that I really like. It was interesting when I started to look for what definition of complex communication needs for the provincial work I'm doing. It was really hard to find. It was in a lot of the papers and in textbooks, but a definition what seemed to me to be a little elusive. So this is one from Australia, and what I really like about it is it puts the focus on AAC benefiting and being a part of both the person with complex communication needs and the partner. So it focuses on the dyad, which I think we all know is so critical, and I think which will show itself as being really important as we go through the talk tonight. All right, so mental health, let's talk about it. I don't know if it's true where all of you are, because I don't know where all of you are, but certainly it's been a big topic of conversation for typically developing kids, for all kids in my province of Alberta. There's a growing understanding that emotionally healthy students are going to be more successful in school, more successful in life. So what I want to put the focus on tonight, I think I've already said this, is what about kids with complex communication needs? Are their mental health needs being unrecognized and unaddressed? Mental health, and again, I'm going to say I am not a mental health expert. I have gathered some resources to share with you tonight, and just to put some context around what we're talking about. What is this thing that we call mental health? It's really a state of well-being. It's the place where we can be comfortable to reach our own potential, whatever that potential is, and where we can work, and I'm going to say learn productively and fruitfully. So having negative mental health issues or having reduced mental health is going to negatively impact our kids' ability to learn, just like it would be any other child's ability to learn. And I think the other thing is that the World Health Organization says is let's one be able to make a contribution. And then I would say and further this, that making a contribution also supports one's mental health going forward. Mental health isn't fixed. It's influenced by a variety of factors, and some of those factors will arise tonight. Experiences and conditions that shape our lives. My personal mental health, to put it in context, when my parents died, my mental health was very poor. I was very stressed. I had a lot of anxiety. Recently, I've had a new grandbaby added to my life, which has increased the positive aspects of my mental health enormously. So it's something that is in constant change for all of us. It's also important to know that mental health exists on a continuum. We're not talking about mental illness here, although if your mental health challenges get severe enough, it could be moved to something that would in fact be a mental illness. One of the things that I see in this slide that I'm going to address as we go through is the idea when kids are injured on the continuum, they have anxiety, anger, pervasive sadness, hopelessness, fatigue, restless sleep. These are things that I hear commonly around our kids that will lash out, kids that don't sleep well. I'm not going to say it is because they have mental health issues. That's not my role or my ability to say, but I want us to think about, might that be a contributing factor? Mental health is very important. It's the underpinning of success and achievement for any student, is the quality of mental health. And this is from a study by Carpenter. And mental health is the basis for good quality of life. Sorry, health is the basis for good quality of life, and mental health is the overriding importance in that. So again, I think for our kids, it's often or could be overlooked in the face of everything else that we need to focus on to make them as successful as they can be. And again, perhaps it often doesn't become an issue because guess what? They don't have the ability to talk about it. It's hard enough for kids who have typically developing language to talk about it, and that's going to be a thing that I'm going to come up to in a minute. There are some this is from a document that, or I took it from a document from Alberta Education, and I'm going to say right now, if any of you want the references or links to any of the documents that I talk about tonight, I'm more than happy to share them. So you can just send me an email. My email is on the last slide. I thought this was particularly valuable chart because we can look at what are the things that are going to protect everyone and protective factors that give positive mental health outcomes. Communication skills right up there. A risk factor, communication difficulties. So de facto, our kids are at risk for mental health. As we go through the talk and share some of the stories, I'm going to highlight some of the other risk factors that can be seen in the stories that the students and young people shared with me. Okay, as I alluded to, language and language abilities matter. And these 45% of students referred to mental health have some kind of communication difficulty. And the second stat I thought was particularly interesting, language difficulties often, or mental health services often go identify as the unidentified, as the focus because of their externalizing or internalizing behavior. And I have in my brain, externalizing behavior, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. How many times do we focus on externalizing behaviors, negative behaviors, kids acting out, rather than perhaps taking the time and trying to figure out a way to explore what might be issues that are negatively impacting their mental health and that cannot be easily expressed. Other thing that we know sort of as background, or that is apparent in how what we know about certain populations of kids, is that some populations put kids automatically at greater risk. There is the idea, and I think that we know pretty well, that there's a higher prevalence of anxiety in kids with autism. So already they might be hypersensitized to some of these issues. Girls with Rett syndrome, again, anxiety is a characteristic. So put them at greater risk. And this was an interesting interesting quote from Scientific World Journal that really we're looking, even for kids with CP, 40 to 50% of them had some kind of emotional and behavioral problems. Again, are those externalizing behaviors that might come from unidentified mental health issues. Our kids are a population at risk. The research shows this very clearly. Children with disabilities are more likely to experience maltreatment and abuse than children without disabilities. I've cited Crowley and Jones here, but there are many studies that would show this. And then this one was particularly, I guess, worrisome to me. The odds of experiencing reported abuse are more than 3 times higher for a child of any type of disability and 4 times higher for a child with intellectual or mental disability than for a child without a disability. And again, this is Dr. Sobsey's work. This is reported maltreatment and abuse. I would venture to say many of our kids have limited to no ways to, without our intentional support and targeting of what might be going on, ways to tell anybody that they have been maltreated. All right, so now to the focus of tonight's talk. What do we need to do? What do we need to think about in terms of providing supports for kids who may be need to talk about abuse and maltreatment? I'm going to focus tonight on the context of schooling because that's the stories that I heard. And I also want you to know that I'm not going to be talking about stories of sexual abuse or physical abuse. The stories that I heard were emotional abuse. The stories that I heard were emotional challenges that for typical kids, we would be worried about their mental health. And for typically developing kids, we would hopefully be getting them supports around their mental health. I think we have understood the issues. No, I'm not even sure that's true. I think there's been a greater awareness of the big hurts, the physical hurts, the sexual hurts. I want us to talk a little bit about the emotional hurts, which really could impact one pretty negatively for the rest of their lives, and that we need to think about that as well. So these stories that I'm going to share with you were gathered during my doctoral dissertation, or my research for my doctoral dissertation, which was mentioned before. I was looking to understand the lived experience of speaking through a speech generating device. I was in no way seeking or looking to hear stories of maltreatment or abuse. And yet those stories came up in enough number that it became something that I thought, I need to write about this or talk about this separate from the other themes that emerged from my research. So tonight's talk is exactly about that. Then I also want to focus on how we might use a very favorite document of mine, and I hope of all of yours, the Communication Bill of Rights. Every one of these rights are fundamentally connected to ensuring students' mental health. This evening, I'm going to highlight a few that seem particularly connected to the story that is being told, but I'm sure if you know the Communication Bill of Rights, you could pick out others that would resonate and say, hey, what about this? What about that? And perhaps at the end of the talk, we can expand on that further. What I'm hoping and what I believe is that by our active discussion and promotion of these rights for our students with complex communication needs, that we will begin and continue the work to enhance their mental health and reduce at least some of the risk factors that they encounter. All right, so off we go into the stories. I go to school in the morning, my tray on my chair with my device. My aide put my device on the wall shelf and take off my tray. I know use my device in the classroom. I know why. My device is taken away, and I don't know why. A child powerless to access the only audible voice they have, and a child who has no way or no power to say why. I think we've all heard from, or perhaps it's maybe only my experience, that people we've all gone back to school and seen devices on the shelves or devices that aren't there when we would expect perhaps they would be. Some of the things that I've heard and others have told me that the people in that environment would say, well, I can understand her without the use of that device. And it's easier without the device in the way, I know what she's thinking and I know what she wants to say and I'll just communicate that for it. Or, it's sitting in front of her and she doesn't really ever use it. These kinds of attitudes, I would argue, and I think I'm going to refer now to a really lovely podcast that Chris Bugai and company did that I'll give you a link to at the end, that say if we don't privilege the use of these devices and the use of kids' language and the development of their language, if we take away or don't provide their devices, we will forevermore leave them at risk of all kinds of maltreatment and abuse. In terms of the risk factors that I talked about on that chart that come from this, communication difficulties, of course. If you don't have it doesn't have to be a device, but if you don't have a communication system that has some language that you can access on your own, you are beholden to what the other people say you are saying, or you may be. Limited access to basic services. If you don't have your device or communication system there, how are you going to engage in learning and development of your language? I would say injustice and discrimination. Would this be done to a talking child? The example I've used, and I imagine many of you have as well, is would you tape the mouth shut of a child who was a big talker in the classroom because you know what they're going to say anyway? Of course you wouldn't. But we see this happening perhaps way too often. Does this lead to a negative sense of self? I would argue it would. I don't know why she's taking away my device. That would be a very troubling experience for a child. Learned helplessness and powerlessness would also be some of the things that I think may happen. So the easy one from the Communication Bill of Rights here is the right to have access to functioning AAC and AT service and devices at all times. I think if we posted this and talked about this and talked about the importance of it, not only to help children develop language, but maybe most importantly, to make sure that they are safe and that they have the ability to express their mental health needs as well as the other kinds of needs and wants that they may have in their lives, that this particular right becomes obvious when we talk about that story. All right, the rest of the stories I'm going to let you hear from the students' mouths.
My first class, we started a group project. My teacher started numbering off people and dividing them into groups. I was nervous to work with new people that I didn't know, but I knew I was going to kick ass at this project, which was a skit. Ordering your favorite food. After everyone had gotten into their groups, I asked which group I was in. And my teacher told me I was better off working by myself. I was scared, livid, and embarrassed. I immediately wanted to withdraw from the class. I had never been so boldly excluded.
Othering and isolation. Imagine being a child who's excited to participate in an activity, hopefully in an inclusive classroom, but whose teacher might judge the fact that you have a different way of interacting and participating as being, you can't participate, you need to do this on your own. I think we need to think about how many times does this othering and isolating happen for our students. It might be not exactly in the way that was just told by this young lady, but it might be in being at the back of the room with the educational assistant while the rest of the kids are doing things. It might be taken out and not put in the regular program because the perception is that you can't participate there anyway. So this othering and isolating could lead to risk factors such as a negative sense of self. Certainly, if you listen to her story, that's what she said. I have never felt so boldly excluded. The sense of exclusion for kids can, I would argue, again, not a mental health expert, but I would argue could have devastating impacts on their mental health, especially if it's a continued practice. Injustice and discrimination. My goodness, why do I, just because I communicate in a different way or because I have a different characteristics, why can't I participate in the whole? And again, with that, the other risk factor, social inequity. This is not an equitable situation. The Communication Bill of Rights right that came up for me is the right to access environmental contexts, interactions, and opportunities that promote participation as a full communication partner with other people, including peers. If we focused on peer connection, peer support, and some of the great work that's being done by Eric Carter and his team out of Vanderbilt, kids would feel a part of the whole. Perhaps teachers would understand that there was other ways to include kids, that they didn't have to be doing it on their own, or they didn't have to be doing it with an educational assistant. I think the important thing here is to say that by focusing on this Bill of Rights, can we reduce that isolation and othering that may be prevalent for our kids with complex communication needs.
I remember when I got my Vantage. I was really excited and wanted to where all the symbols were and how to say things with it.
Sorry.
I came up with a great idea. Every Friday my class went roller skating. Everybody, teachers, aides, kids, everybody. While this was fun for lots of the kids, I roll around all day already, so it wasn't a lot of fun for me. So I asked if I could stay back at school on Fridays to learn my device. At first the school said no, everyone had to go, but when my mom got mad they changed their minds. One of the teachers had to stay back with me. I was so happy. I thought I would have some real time to learn and someone who I could talk to and practice with, but that is not how it went. The teacher was so mad at having to stay back at school instead of going to the roller rink that he didn't talk to me the whole time. I just sat exploring my device on my own and he sat marking papers or whatever at his desk. So much for that great idea. I could have talked to myself at the roller rink.
I could have talked to myself at the roller rink. What perhaps there's many things that jump out from here, but the big one for me was abuse of power. Kid, you're not going to rule my life. And in terms of the power and the power wheel, there's been some work done by many people on that stems from women that have been in positions of abuse and power to describe their experiences. And this wheel illustrates forms of abuse that also have been experienced by people with developmental disabilities, abused by their paid caretakers. I would say that was abuse by his paid caretaker. This child wants to learn his system, really says, I need something special, which I think all of our kids are supposed to get in special education, and certainly are supposed to get the supports they need to learn their systems. But instead, what we see here is caretaker privilege, a different way of isolation. It wasn't isolating from the pack. The child wanted to be taken away from an activity that he didn't or she didn't particularly see as useful. But boy, when they got their way, shall we say, isolated, certainly this is an example of misholding and withholding abuse, and I would argue emotional abuse. So here I had to pull a few issues from the communication or rights from the Communication Bill of Rights that I think are particularly relevant, that we need to focus on and that we could call out. In this instance, the right to express personal preferences and feelings. This kid had the right to say, you know, it's really important for me to learn this system. There's this opportunity. The roller rink doesn't do it for me. Can you please help me? The right to access interventions and support to supports that improve communication. Here's a child who is saying, please, can you give me some time to work with me? And because perhaps, and we don't know that this is a teacher, that he said teacher, it could have been a teacher assistant. I don't really know, but whoever that adult who had the power did not spend the time with that child to learn the system, instead was punished. And again, finally, I think to be treated with dignity and addressed with respect and courtesy. It was a very undignified experience that child had to endure, basically because the teacher was annoyed.
The year I turned 10 was a really hard year for me.
I don't remember, sorry, this one doesn't work. I don't remember my teacher much, except that he was gorgeous. It was left to Miss W, my EA, to mainly do the teaching for me. I was a really rebellious 10-year-old. You see, that was the year my mom went back to work. When you're used to having your mom around 24 hours a day, it was a shock. I felt really alone and abandoned. This particular story stood out for me because I think for our typically developing kids, for our kids for whom are talking and can tell us, this might be an instance where a school would recognize that something was going on, a child who's being rebellious. And it's kind of funny when you'll hear a little bit how she said she was being rebellious, hardly rebellious in my mind. But what's going on for you? This would be a time that for many kids, the mental health services might say, oh, you know, your mom's going back. We know that's hard. Do you want to talk about it? Shall we talk about it? That's a big theme that is going around in Alberta right now. Can we talk? This little girl didn't have the way to talk, and that feeling of abandonment and being alone clearly would have had a negative impact on her mental health.
Elementary school was pretty rough, although maybe I didn't know it at the time. How could I have? It was the only life I knew. I was in the regular classroom during elementary school, and I had a teaching assistant. She did not want to be with a kid like me, not a kid that drooled, and had to be taken to the bathroom, and had to be lifted, and had to be fed. She sure wasn't interested in hearing what I have to say, either through my communication board or through my device when I got it. I remember when she took me to the bathroom, she would tell me that I was fat and that I would be a burden to my mom and dad. Then in class, she would tell me to quit drooling and yell at me in front of all the other kids. I just got to feel really bad about myself and mostly didn't take the risk to say anything. Thinking back on it now, think she was the one that silenced me.
My takeaway from that story is that we need to recognize that safe places and safe people may not be. It's important to recognize that in some instances, it may indeed be the school staff that are the abusers. I'll talk more about that in a bit.
I did all sorts of things to rebel, like not doing my work or slowing down my reading. Instead of asking me what was the problem, Mrs. W decided to teach me a lesson by bullying me. She did this bullying in the bathroom where I couldn't fight back because I had no device there. She said I was fat and going to be a burden to my mom and dad when I grew up. She also said I smelled. I got so nervous going to the bathroom, I pooped my pants. I endured this bullying for over 2 years.
That particular story, every time I hear it again or read it again, really hurts my heart. A child would be so stressed that they would lose control over their bodily functions. There's been other kids in my lived experience that coming into new environments that were, quote, trained before, suddenly require diapers again. It's usually seen as a behavior, but might it be something more around their mental health? And as I promised, not happily, here are some statistics that say it may well be, or it could be, school staff. And again, this is about sexual abuse, which is the thing that rises up or has risen up. But it's important to recognize from this study from 2014 that sexual abuse of students with disabilities in American schools, most of our research comes from America, school staff were responsible for about half of the cases. Students being responsible for the other half. I'm going to argue that students, if half of the abuse comes from the adults, students are learning that it's okay to be abusive. These stats kind of still shock me when I read them. Teaching staff, which might be teachers, educational assistants, 30% of the perpetrators. Other school staff, sorry guys, PTs and SLPs, 8%. Non-professional school staff, that would be janitors and the like, 6%. Transportation providers, 5%. And look at this one, 21% are school administrators. Yikes. So this brings me to my friend, Erin Sheldon, and a new article that she wrote in Impact. If you haven't read it, I hugely recommend that you do. When Erin Sheldon was first thinking about her daughter Maggie and her concerns about keeping her safe, she had a conversation with Lou Brown, and Lou Brown said to Erin that her daughter's safety would be found in wide open spaces with people who knew her well but had no power over her. She would be most vulnerable in separate settings with people who had power over her and no competent witnesses. Okay, so here we go. We need to teach our kids that bullying is not just encountered by their peers, that sadly bullying may occur from adults as well. This is really important that we build and that kids have the right to interact socially, maintain social closeness, and build relationships with people who can tell what's going on, who maybe can voice something if they cannot voice it themselves. And of course, again, number 13, the right to be treated with dignity and addressed in respect and courtesy.
She also sent me out of the classroom for drooling, because she heard some other schools did it that way. That year I got my first talking device, which was called a touch talker. My therapist came into school to teach me mid-speak. I feel she did a great job teaching me where the icons were and what they meant. She did not teach me how to express myself with it. For example, one particular day I was sent out of the classroom for drooling, but really I had sneezed out some muffin. For the life of me, I couldn't find the words to say that I had just sneezed.
Okay, just for a little while, I'm going to put the focus directly on us, those of us who are responsible for supporting kids and developing kids' communication competence. We need to focus on linguistic competence. That's hugely important, but also that strategic competence, that way to say something when you can't find the word, when you're struggling to find the word, when you maybe need to negotiate something. I think that's clearly evidenced in that story. And again, in terms of the Communication Bill of Rights, the right to refuse or reject undesired actions or choices. This child, if it was a talking child, would easily have been able to say, no, I don't need to go to the classroom. Now, maybe they would have been chastised for being uppity or talking back, but at least they would have gotten to voice their rejection of this undesired action. And again, the right to access interventions and support and improve their communication, which clearly she needed more supports, which perhaps all of our kids do. The next few stories are going to be focused not in the classroom so much as in healthcare environments.
I love Piku. I actually call it Azkaban, and I've named my least favorite intensive Voldemort. I hate it there because it's so grim. They always talk about me and of me like I'm not there. I want to yell, I can understand. The worst part is the scary shit they talk about, like worst case scenario stuff. I'm kind of used to it now, but it's the crap out of me the first time.
Yeah, scared the crap out of you. Yes, indeed. Psychological trauma. I think a child being in a hospital and hearing people talk about worst case scenarios and what's going to happen to them while not being able to voice anything about it is particularly traumatic. Perhaps the doctors and nurses would do that if there was a child there that they understood could speak, or that they perhaps understood was competent. But when we have a child with complex communication needs, do we understand that they aren't competent? And this brings me to perhaps, for me, one of the most important of the rights, the right to be addressed and talked directly to, and not, sorry, addressed directly and not spoken for or talked about in the third person. I see this all the time. I know that I can fall to doing this, but what is it like to be sitting there while the adults around you talk about you? Maybe not talk about you and what the traumatic medical event is going to be, but maybe talk about you in terms of what your programming is going to be, or, well, we don't really know if she knows that, or this, I think, would be a clear indication or clear way to build a negative sense of self for a child who can't communicate, to build a learned helplessness, and something that I think we really, really need to think about in terms of mental health, as well as just being good practice for any child. Okay, so this one I'm going to read to you for, oops, sorry, because it's sort of a combination. The first part, we went in a little doctor's office and see 3 people. The first person was my back doctor. The second person was the kid helper. They told me and my mom that we need to add guardianship for me. I was afraid about a future without mom. The family worker said that mom had to go to court to get the papers. Then I'm watching her search through her device to say something. She's going, John Hancock, John Hancock. She tries a few other things. She can't seem to find the words in her device. So she reverts to trying to spell it. She goes, signed. And then she says, I thought yes. Then she looks at me and wiggles her body. And she obviously didn't mean that last word. Then she says, I thought, why do mom change my last name to Hansen to be done with it? Now we're confused. What does she mean? And we asked her to tell us. I am going to be all hers. I want to be Hansen.
For years I was trying to tell it to mom. My dad is not a family guy. 13 years I had a puzzle. For 13 years I was a puzzle to my mom with a song. For 13 years I want mom to hear a piece of the song.
This is an instance where a child didn't have the language to tell us what was going on. What was really happening for her, as we came to understand, was her dad was ill, and she was worried that her mom was going to have to care greatly for her dad. And then suddenly these people came to talk about this guardianship thing, didn't explain it to her, and she understood it, that she was going to be taken away from her mom. What she was meaning is, could I have my mom's name so I can be only for her? So she didn't have the language. Language development matters greatly so that we can help our kids to share their worries, their concerns, their misunderstandings, and their understandings of what's happening for them. The other thing that happened for me in this instance, because when I did understand what was happening for her, I tried to get some counseling services. The university that I was at the time, that was in my department, was where we were training the counselors. I went to them. I said, can we do this? Can I help you? And people said, yeah, that's really important. And then did that sort of turn away with the deer in the headlights look. She never did get counseling services. This is a child for whom, if she was typically developing and talker, the issues around her father's ill health would have been enough to bring her into some kind of counseling services. Other issues that were going on in her life certainly warranted that. Again, Communication Bill of Rights that I think are particularly important here: the right to ask for and give information, including information about changes in routine and environment. This kid was thrown into this environment in the hospital, and they talked, and sort of goes with 14 again, they talked about this thing, and she didn't understand what was going on, and she didn't get to talk about it. She needed to have the right to be informed about the events in her life. What did that mean? What questions did she have? That wasn't availed to her. So these, as I'm seeing time is ticking away, are the stories from those who have the means to tell us. There are many more who don't. The kids that I talked to in my study all had speech generating devices, and probably would be pretty close to Pat Dowden's independent communicator. There are many more kids that I know all of us share who we might worry about their mental health, but we don't know that they have the capacity at this point to tell us that. So here are some ideas that I have. As I've thought about this, I hope as I go through this quickly, we'll have some discussion around more ideas. The first thing that came to me with this is narrative. And here's the reason why. When I used to pick my kids up after school and I would say, what happened to you today? Or how did your day go? They would tell me about their day. It had to be the first 10 minutes after school or else they were closed and that was the end of it. But I think for our kids, we need to put a greater emphasis on narrative, a greater emphasis on saying, what happened to you today? How was your day? Tell me about your day. Your story, your day matters. Now, it might be really simple things at the beginning while they're emerging communicators. But if we don't support and help these kids to tell their narrative, how will they be able to say this to anyone else? The kids in my study had a very difficult time telling a story of their lives. That was a foreign entity to them. I had to work for a long time to say, tell me about a time. For typically developing kids, for all of us to tell our stories is an easy thing. It's what we do all the time. So I think greater emphasis on narrative across the domain might be something that we should do. The other thing that is really important, but also I kind of don't know what to do about, is that to get these stories takes time. Sometimes I sat for hours with these young people to gather their stories. What hurt my heart is when the moms were there, and especially in the case of the young lady who was so maltreated by her educational assistant, her mom was there and sort of broke down in tears and said, I never knew. And this was a very engaged mom. But it took me 2 or 3 hours to sit to listen to that story. What parent has 2 or 3 hours at the end of the day to sit and not do anything else but listen to a story? We have to figure out some ways to help reshape and reshift time, or to address at least to think about the idea that even if they can tell us their stories, it's going to take a long time to do that, time that we don't often afford to our kids. Counseling services. I addressed the fact that there aren't counseling services or a lack of them. I saw on Facebook today and some other places that this is beginning to be addressed. I think that's marvelous. We need to be advocating for that. And if we don't have counselors that can do it, one of the interesting ways, and a shout out to Barbara Collier and Communication Disabilities Access Canada, who has communication intermediaries that work when people are in the justice system. So people that can help to communicate for people who struggle. This is great in the justice system, but it's, I would argue, lacking in the mental health system. Do we need to think about building people who can be communication intermediaries for our kids with complex communication needs? An example, sorry I can't show you, but please go and watch, is the communication intermediary Gail Van Tatenhof, and how she understood, using the power of core vocabulary, that this young man wasn't being fed in his group home. It's a great example of someone understanding and taking forth a message that would otherwise perhaps be unheard. The importance of safe, inclusive spaces. Erin Sheldon is an advocate of this. Eric Carter's work, where we think about building peers that can care about and talk for and support our kids, and the dangers, I have to say, of segregated settings. I need to be careful again. I'm sorry, I know my time is running out, but maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. Practice saying no. Our kids need to be able to say no. A blog worth reading is Star in Her Eye, where she challenges us to say, are we teaching our kids with intellectual and other disabilities to be more compliant than typical kids? Or are we actually actively teaching them to stand up for themselves, to assert their will, however inconvenient for those who are their caregivers? We can practice saying no. Paul, my friend, says we can practice saying no at breakfast, at lunch. Help our kids to say no and mean it and respect it. If you want to hear more about this, as I alluded to this wonderful podcast from Talking with Tech from Rebecca Moles, she's talking about more severe cases of abuse, but again, they talk about the issues of language and how we need to really focus on vocabulary and communication abilities for our kids. Some resources that might help. I talked about the Communication Bill of Rights. I've alluded to the CEC's new policy on prevention of response to maltreatment and the work that's being done by the Communication Disabilities Access Canada. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments. Most of all, I hope we continue this conversation. We continue to talk about it because our kids need it and are worth it.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very informative hour. Thank you all for participating this evening. Just a reminder to please complete the evaluation that will be emailed to you. And we're especially interested in suggestions for future topics. As a member, and there were a couple questions regarding the CEUs for tonight. You will get CEUs by going to the website that was shown to you earlier in this presentation. It's www.isaac.online.org/English/news/webinars. And there was another question about CEUs being offered for those of you who are not USAAC members. For tonight's webinar, only CEUs are only available for members, but that will not be the case in future webinars. In future webinars, there will be a fee for non-members for CEUs. Really quick, future topics. Please save the dates, June 4th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Dave, and thank you, there's the link to get your CEUs. Dave Barnes and E.A. Drafen are going to be presenting on June 4th, Global Systems, Design and Use of Symbols that Reflect Local Language and Culture. And on September 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern, AAC Disaster Relief Committee is going to be presenting on AAC and disasters. Are you ready? So we only have a few more minutes, but there was one question that we were hoping you could address, Kathy, and that is, how would you recommend finding a counselor or a mental health provider who's experienced working with someone who uses AAC?
I wish I had a good answer for you. I guess what I would do is perhaps go to someone like the doctor that they interviewed on Talking with Tech and see if she would have some sources or resources. I would go and contact places in my world like Inclusion Alberta, because they tend to support people that way. I think one of the things that I'm hoping perhaps could be a follow to this is that we could brainstorm that a little bit more. I was not successful in that endeavor, and so I continue to search myself. So sorry, I don't have a great answer.
Okay, yeah, I know it's really tough to find professionals who are skilled at working with students with complex communication needs.
I think raising the issue and talking about the issue is our first step.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. This was a very, very informative session, and I'm going to let Franklin take over and talk to you about the exciting things going on in 2020.
Thank you very much, Betsy, and thank you very much, Kathy, for a very engaging webinar this evening. Just very briefly, everyone, we do like to finish on time, and I see it is 1 minute to 8. So I will just invite everyone to please keep your eyes on the Isaac International website. Our Conference 2020 leadership team is working really hard at getting everything ready for the launch of our call for papers for Conference 2020. We anticipate being able to go live on that probably it'll be happening in June or July. So please do keep your eyes on the Isaac website, and we're hoping that you're going to put in your calendars August 1st through 6th of 2020 to be in beautiful sunny Mexico for Isaac Conference 2020. So thank you again very much. If this was an absolutely fabulous webinar, thank you for everyone being in attendance. And as Betsy mentioned, please do feel free to join us for our upcoming webinars. Thanks very much again, Betsy and Kathy. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Thanks for participating.